And then shall appear the sign. Matthew chapter 24 KJV, verse 30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, with power and great glory. In previous episodes of this study, I revealed that the sign of the Son of Man in heaven is the Lamb. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, we read of a sign that will appear in heaven. This sign will be seen by all the tribes of the earth, meaning everyone, or at least the surviving mankind, from verse 29, in that future of Matthew chapter 24, verse 30. And the sight of this sign will immediately precede the second coming of Jesus Christ in that same verse 30. What do I mean by the surviving mankind of verse 29? Matthew chapter 24 KJV verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Verse 29, whether it be understood in its literal sense or interpreted as that of a global crisis from multiple causes on nations and church, and not literally that of some cataclysm that would hit the planet, as the verse appears in its literal understanding. Verse 29 appears catastrophic beyond that of anything experienced since civilization began. When it comes to the sign of the Son of Man in heaven in verse 30, only here in Matthew chapter 24 verse 30, we see written of a sign that will precede or signal the second coming of Jesus Christ in verse 30. From the questions made from Jesus' apostles in Matthew chapter 24 verse 3 KJV. Verse 3, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Only from what we read in Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, and in verse 30, of what is preceding the coming of Jesus in verse 30, before the rapture in verse 31, what we read between verse 29 and verse 30 already proves that every preaching that has the rapture in verse 31, a complete surprise event without any warning, is a false preaching. And who preaches this, no matter of what church authority, is a deceiver and false prophet. One may not agree that Matthew chapter 24 verse 30-31 is the second coming of Jesus Christ, and that the second coming of Jesus Christ is the coming in Revelation chapter 19 verses 11-21, or both being the same coming. But it is undeniable that the second coming of Jesus Christ, whether it be Matthew chapter 24 verse 30-31, or Revelation chapter 19 verses 11-21, or both being the same coming, the rapture of the church in Matthew chapter 24 verse 31, immediately following Jesus' coming in verse 30, is preceded by a sign in heaven. And that sign is an unknown sign that Matthew chapter 24 verse 30 does not reveal. Before the rapture, there is a sign that will appear in heaven. The appearance of that sign signals the rapture, and that sign is no small detail or minor event, because as I will show in the course of this study, that sign of the Son of Man in heaven is among the most major events in Bible end-time prophecy, second only to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And that sign, and what will come minutes, if not seconds, after it appears, explains much of that insane world of the reign of the beast, where madness appears to have become normal human behavior. All we know in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, about this sign that will precede Jesus' coming in verse 30, one verse before the rapture in verse 31, is by what we read of this sign in verse 30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Matthew chapter 24, verse 30 does not reveal what this sign is, and nowhere in Matthew chapter 24 is this sign revealed, at least not directly as that sign in verse 30. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Through my previous episodes, I revealed it being the Lamb of Revelation chapter 5, verse 6. Revelation chapter 5, verse 6 KJV. Verse 6. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne, and of the four beasts, and in the midst of the elders, stood a Lamb, as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God, sent forth into all the earth. The second coming of Jesus Christ in verse 30, and the rapture in verse 31, is preceded by the sight of a sign in heaven in verse 30, and that sign will be seen by everyone in verse 30. Verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. After or during the sight of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, all the tribes of the earth will see the coming of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 24 KJV, verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. The order would have of at least 3 major events in Matthew chapter 24 between verse 29 and 30 that will precede the rapture of the church in verse 31. The first of these major events, Matthew chapter 24 verse 29, that, as I said, if understood literally or interpreted, appears catastrophic on global proportions, to say the least. The second of these major events is after verse 29. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven is seen by everyone all across the globe in verse 30. The third of these major events is that everyone at the sight of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, or immediately after, will see the coming of Jesus, and his coming will be seen by every living person on earth, or at least that living after verse 29. 3 major events witnessed by every single person on earth, including the coming of Jesus Christ. Among these 3 major events that are seen and witnessed before the rapture of verse 31. Matthew chapter 24 KJV verse 31. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. I ask myself, how could someone, and every pastor, that in preaching the rapture of the church reveal himself a false prophet, preaching a rapture of the surprise event, when that rapture, literally written in front of their eyes, is no surprise event, but also, along with preaching the false rapture of the surprise event, and without warning, preaches also that the rapture would come any moment, when there are at least 3 major events immediately before the rapture, and before those 3 major events there are at least 15 verses of events in Matthew chapter 24 still to be fulfilled, from verse 14 to 28. And still there are those that preach the rapture of the surprise event, that could come any moment. This false rapture has been preached for at least 70 years, or at least since this generation began. That rapture never came, and still it is preached. Lots of people ruined their lives by selling all their possessions, chasing after the preachings of their raving wolves pastors, preaching to them a rapture that could come any moment, any minute, hour, or any day. Job opportunities lost forever, careers destroyed, bank accounts emptied, children traumatized. The money all to give over to their church, pastors becoming cult leaders and rich overnight. They don't even understand their own preachings. But what they do understand very well is all the money and attention to themselves flowing into their ministries by preaching what their followers want to be preached. After having heard of a rapture, of the easy way out of this world and from out of their troubled lives, the weak-minded and broken-hearted, the easy prey of every wolf. False preachings on the rapture are among the reasons that cause a falling away in the church. False rapture dates and even as the rapture as preached cause the church to become a joke that has the world laugh and church people laughed. Church people leave for other spiritualities, so not to be laughed at. False prophets in the church have people question, do they doubt the word of God? Not just because the rapture date was wrong, with no rapture, but also because the preaching was wrong. And when the preaching is wrong, then what else could be wrong in those preachings? And preachings in general. Preachers end up preaching more themselves than the Christ of the preachings. The pastor becomes the Christ of its false preaching, and from false prophet becomes also a false Christ. Among those three major events that will precede the rapture of the church after verse 29, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven and the coming of Jesus Christ, there is one event that no one is preaching, that alone reveals that the coming of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30-31, is the most catastrophic event in human history, even more catastrophic than the coming of Jesus on the battle of Armageddon. The end of the world is not in Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, though what we read in verse 29 appears to be the end of the world. The world ends at the sight of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. The world ends even before the coming of Jesus in that same verse 30, followed then by the rapture in verse 31. Matthew chapter 24, KJV, verse 30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Verse 30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. That mourn of all the tribes of the earth is the end of the world. What is it? It is the worst of all ends of the world. It is an end so bad that it would be better as end of the world, a global nuclear war with every nuclear warhead being fired. It would be better for all mankind to die immediately vaporized than that end in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, of that, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. Imagine yourselves dead, but something of you is still alive, alive enough to realize that what was alive of you till the sight of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven is now gone from you, and that not even death can free you from this condition. And even if you were to seek death, death has fled from you. Revelation chapter 9, KJV, verse 6. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. The most horrifying sight in human history, at the sight of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Imagine what it would be like if every ungodly person were to see itself as a damned soul in hell, and the world all around that person having become hell, each and every person. And it would be experienced by everyone, including the alive and remain of the church, before it is caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. For the world, the sight of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven will cause a global madness. For the church, it will be a shock. The Lord will send his angels to take his church out of a world gone mad. Matthew chapter 24, verse 31. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Thank you.